Sometimes in the media, there's a very quick passing mention that's easy to miss. But when you go back and listen to it again, you realize that it says so much about the state of news today. And that happened recently. In an earlier episode, I played you a little clip from a conversation on The Daily Show between Jon Stewart, the host, and Christiane Amanpour of CNN. I explained how it was based on lies about Israel and the war against Hamas in Gaza. But there was also this exchange that exposes lies about something else.
On social media, on various things, or with Al Jazeera, the world is certainly seeing a very different picture than what Western journalism is showing.
That is very true. And if this terrible law goes through to throw out any organization from Gaza, including Al Jazeera, it would be a terrible thing. Yet another chilling effect on trying to tell the truth.
Al Jazeera being hailed as some sort of trustworthy beacon of truth. From the way people in the mainstream media talk about it so often, you wouldn't know that Al Jazeera is a state-owned propaganda outlet of the Qatari government. Qatar, as in the nation that harbors Hamas leaders who live as billionaires in extreme wealth while doing nothing to help the people of Gaza. And the problem isn't just that the mainstream media ignore this and often hide it. They actually go further. They actively praise it. Meanwhile, Al Jazeera stays busy praising terrorists. You'll hear that ahead. And I'll tell you about someone from inside Al Jazeera who blew the whistle on how it shills for the Qatari government. The media's role in whitewashing Al Jazeera became clearer to me than ever during a dispute last year. It was a dispute that focused on something else. It involved Elon Musk and Twitter, and also NPR and other news organizations around the world. It showed hypocrisy in recognizing what is and is not state media, and I'll talk you through that in today's episode. You'll also hear this, how the media's frequent obsession with adoring Al Jazeera has led news organizations to relatively downplay or even outright ignore the deaths of journalists in dangerous situations all over the world. It's time for a major reality check on this, and it's coming up today on They Stand Corrected. Hello and welcome. I'm Josh Levs. For those of you who don't know, I spent 20 years in mainstream media, 10 of them on NPR, 10 of them on CNN. I became a fact checker on air and online, and discovered in the process how incredibly much news you get has not been fact checked. With each episode, I send out a newsletter packed with links and images and more information. You can find that at the link in the show notes, and we now have it set up so it's all inside my website, joshlevs.com, JOSHLEVS.com. Check out the site. That's also linked in the show notes, and you can see everything right there. I also answer your questions. I just last week did a whole episode answering a bunch of your questions about different topics of the news. You can always send me whatever you want fact-checked, and I might get to it. All right, let's dig into today's topic. As a rule, when an outlet that calls itself news is owned by a government, particularly an authoritarian government, news organizations identify it as being state-owned. At least they're supposed to. Listen to how NPR accurately described sources of information from Iran.
In Iran, state media are reporting the seizure of another tanker in the Persian Gulf.
And China.
And state media will often talk about how the foreign press is hyping a China story, always focusing on the negative.
Russia.
A major Russian warship in the Black Sea has sunk, according to a state-owned Russian news agency.
And Afghanistan.
An earthquake struck overnight. It struck remote areas that may take time to reach, but already Afghan state media say 900 people are dead.
In each case, that was accurate. These are state-owned outlets providing information, and you need to know that. I'm starting with NPR because NPR got into a dispute about this same issue last year. Elon Musk owns Twitter, now called X. He slapped these labels onto certain news outlets, including NPR, as state-affiliated media. In reality, a small percentage of NPR's funding is public. The overwhelming majority comes from donations, especially those that come in during pledge drives. I used to do a lot of airtime during my NPR days, getting people to call in during pledge drives. If you want to see the numerical breakdowns of NPR funding, I'll make that available in the newsletter. But the key here is what happened between NPR and Twitter. All right, and I promise this will come right back to Al Jazeera. Follow me here. So, NPR is a private nonprofit. So, a lot of people at NPR, including executives, understandably got angry at Twitter, and the network announced that it would stop using its Twitter channels in response. Individuals at NPR still use Twitter, but the organizational accounts stopped. NPR discussed this on the air. Here's a clip from one segment they did.
And this comes after Twitter slapped a label on the main NPR account suggesting a false equivalency with state-sponsored outlets in Russia, China, and other autocratic nations.
NPR brought in media correspondent David Folkenflik.
I mean, it's giving us this NPR the same designation it would give to, these propaganda outlets for autocratic regimes.
And listen to what host Lila Fadel added here.
We aren't influenced by governments in that way.
Yeah, and the false implication that we are is incredibly dangerous for our journalists working independently around the world.
That's a fair point. It can be dangerous to get this wrong. That's another reason that news organizations themselves should make sure that they're accurate in reporting about these issues. And as I played for you just a minute ago, NPR does say state media when it's state-owned media, particularly in nations that don't have democratic freedom of expression. But not always. There is a prominent exception.
A very different trial continues to unfold in Egypt. 3 journalists from the news channel Al Jazeera English are awaiting a verdict.
What you just heard is one of many reports in which Al Jazeera is discussed with no mention of it being a Qatari state-owned news agency. This also happens often when NPR discusses Al Jazeera in the context of Israel.
Israel demolished a building in Gaza that housed the Associated Press and Al Jazeera. Israel claimed Palestinian militants also used the building.
That one is a 4-minute story with a bunch of references to Al Jazeera and no mention of it being state-owned news. Now, sometimes you do hear Qatar mentioned, and the wording is very interesting.
Al Jazeera, the Qatar-financed media giant, launched a new online platform targeting an American conservative audience. It is called Rightly.
Qatar financed. That sounds so much less concerning than Qatar owned. But it is owned by Qatar. In fact, the U.S. State Department notes this in its current human rights report about Qatar. I was curious to see how Al Jazeera covered this dispute between NPR and Twitter. Here's what Al Jazeera wrote. Quote, "The new label has not been added to some other state-funded media, including Al Jazeera and France 24, which are funded by the Qatari and French governments respectively." Okay, when I saw that, I was like, oh, I see what you're doing there. Clever. This is a perfect example of something that I've talked about before on this show. In order to have truth, you need 2 things, facts plus context. But you don't have the truth until you get the context. So it is a fact that France 24 is also government-owned. Yep. But a news outlet being owned by a democratic government like France is very different from a news outlet being owned by an authoritarian government. In a democracy, government officials have to try to appeal to the people to get their votes. And the people can demand legitimate reporting from the media. The people can choose to elect leaders who will then give the media the independence to cover stuff. The BBC gets the bulk of its funding from a license fee paid by the public. The BBC also gets incredibly critical against its own government. When you have a democratic system, there is a level of media freedom that does not exist without that democratic system. Now, I'm not saying it's a perfect system. People could absolutely complain that these outlets don't do enough one way or the other. I myself have pointed to huge flaws with the BBC. Anyway, it's very different from when a quote-unquote news outlet like Al Jazeera is owned by a non-democratic government. Remember these words that we just heard in that NPR clip?
Suggesting a false equivalency with state-sponsored outlets in Russia, China, and other autocratic nations.
Every year, there's something called the Democracy Index. It looks at governments all over the world. I recently mentioned it in a 2-parter that I did about Jordan in response to a listener's request. Out of 167 countries, Qatar is ranked all the way down at 111. It's listed as authoritarian. Meanwhile, if you look at the U.S. State Department's latest human rights report about Qatar, here's a little bit of what you'll see. The law prohibits criticism of the emir. The emir, by the way, is the ruler, or as Qatar itself puts it, the monarch. Qatari law restricts the establishment of news outlets and lets the government close outlets and confiscate their assets. Here's a quote from the Human Rights Report. Quote, members of the ruling family or proprietors who enjoyed close ties to government officials owned all print media. Both private and government-owned television and radio reflected government views. Here's one more quote. Some observers and former Al Jazeera employees alleged the government influenced the content produced by that news outlet. The Qatar Media Corporation, the Ministry of Culture, and customs officials censored material, etc., etc., etc. Some people who work for Al Jazeera English try really hard to pretend that it's somehow totally different from Al Jazeera in Arabic. But it's the same outlet owned by the government of Qatar. And by the way, how it operates each day doesn't have any effect on whether or not it's state-owned. So the rule about telling people that it's state-owned in your coverage would obviously still apply. Some whistleblowers who have worked for Al Jazeera have talked about this. One is Mohammed Fahmy, who was once Al Jazeera's Cairo bureau chief. He spent more than a year in jail in Egypt. He later did an interview with Bloomberg. Here is a clip from a Jerusalem Post story that references that Bloomberg interview.
The more the network coordinated and takes directions from the Qatar government, the more it becomes a mouthpiece for Qatari intelligence, he said in a June interview with Bloomberg. Looking back, Fahmy says he was surprised to learn that Al Jazeera English was not as separate as he believed from the Arabic network's other interests. The network coordinated and took directives from Qatar's government.
I know people who work for Al Jazeera English and who worked for Al Jazeera America, which existed briefly. And I've written columns or had posts on social media in which I've mentioned that the network is state-owned by Qatar. And it's amazing. I've actually had people I know tell me that they're offended that I even mentioned that. Yep. If someone is offended by a fact, then they're the problem. They just don't want you to be aware that they worked for the Qatari government. Or they say, oh, yeah, well, Al Jazeera has won journalism awards. Well, so what? Every propaganda outlet owned by an authoritarian government also does some legitimate journalism. In keeping with the media's own rules, every story about Al Jazeera should include an acknowledgement that it is owned by the government of Qatar, a government that's also incredibly repressive in other ways, by the way, against women, against LGBTQ plus people. There are horrific reports of what people undergo in Qatar. And yet, Al Jazeera has still gotten this image to many Americans of being progressive. And it takes advantage of the fact that most Americans don't speak Arabic. Coming up, how Al Jazeera itself in Arabic celebrates acts of terror and cheers them on. I'm not talking coverage of celebrations. I'm talking the network itself celebrating. That's after this. In March 2022, there was a string of terrorist attacks against Israel. Some media around the world covered it, including the BBC.
I can say at this stage, this is the most deadly attack of its kind in Israel in years. And unfortunately, it's only a week since I last said that. We had a medic in the ultra-Orthodox Jewish neighborhood of Bnei Brak, which is to the east of Tel Aviv, describing finding victims spread out at intervals along the street. Some of them had been on foot.
Of course, that was before last year's massive terrorist attacks on October 7th. There's video from this March 2022 attack. The Jerusalem Post described it.
A video later circulating on social media showed the attacker yelling in Arabic, shooting bystanders with an assault rifle on a residential street.
The people killed included a father of 5, a father of 2, an Arab-Israeli guard, and 2 workers from Ukraine. These folks just happened to be out there when this terrorist came along to try to kill anyone he could. After that attack, Al Jazeera heaped praise on the attacker. Of course, they do this all the time in Arabic. There's a group called the Investigative Project on Terrorism. They've written about this, and I'll include a link to this in the newsletter. One of Al Jazeera's top anchors called this attacker so courageous and posted a video of the shooting, including the attacker shooting and killing someone who just happened to be driving by in a car. Al Jazeera wrote this glowing profile of him, praising, no joke, his gentleness. You can't make this stuff up. But people in big mainstream news outlets, like Christiane Amanpour from CNN, as you heard, and like NPR, they don't mention this stuff. Even when they interview people from Al Jazeera, they don't stop and say, hey, how come your staff says and does this? Obviously, a big reason in cases like this, as I've explained before, is that journalists at these mainstream news outlets dehumanize Israelis and believe lies about Israel. So they don't actually care that Al Jazeera does this. But How about this? Al Jazeera also gets basic facts wrong. It was the worst purveyor of lies about the alleged hospital bombing during the war against Hamas in Gaza in October. You might remember this. News media were all over it with these lies. They were saying that Israel had dropped a bomb on a hospital, killing 500 people. It turned out that it was a rocket fired by militants inside Gaza that did not land on, but next to a hospital. And as soon as it became clear that it wasn't Israel, suddenly the alleged death toll went way, way down. There was a really good op-ed about this, published by Haaretz. It was written by Ksenia Svetlova, the director of the Israel Middle East program at something called Mitvim, which is the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policy.
While we don't expect much of Qatar-based Al Jazeera, which gladly provides an open microphone for Hamas leaders, one would expect minimal standards in regards to coverage of Hamas by Western media. After all, the Hamas-run Ministry of Health is about as reliable as an Orwellian Ministry of Truth.
There's also a weird thing that happened involving Al Jazeera and this story about the hospital bombing. In the fog of war, as the news was breaking, someone claiming to be with Al Jazeera posted on Twitter saying that they were from inside Al Jazeera and that Al Jazeera was lying and that it was not an Israeli bombing. Later, a bunch of media reported about that, saying that that person was not really with Al Jazeera. So that story made Al Jazeera the apparent victim of this other hoax. But then that story got so much more attention than what Al Jazeera actually did. Whoever that person was, that person did not do 1/1 billionth, literally, of the damage that Al Jazeera did by pushing the lie about Israel bombing a hospital to so many people all over the world who still to this day believe it, because Al Jazeera has never made an effort to reach them again with the truth. At another point in this war, Al Jazeera was interviewing a Palestinian man. He started saying in Arabic, "Why is Hamas hiding among us? Why don't they go to hell and hide there? They are not resistance." And Al Jazeera immediately cut him off because that is just not what they want to hear. I'll post a video of that in the newsletter. Then more recently came another Al Jazeera disaster. The network ran a report claiming this horrific stuff about Israeli soldiers raping women at a hospital. The amazing thing is that Al Jazeera actually pulled the report after it became clear it was a hoax. They obviously had their own reasons for doing that. They certainly didn't feel any guilt about it, and they didn't do anything to get the word out to everyone who had seen it that it was fake. They basically just quietly pulled it and put something on social media saying, oh, someone had exaggerated in order to get sympathy and blah, blah, blah. These lies literally get people killed. There was a great conversation about this on I-24 with Michal Kotler-Wunsch. She's the Israeli special envoy for combating anti-Semitism.
After being peddled on Al Jazeera and, as you said, other traditional media outlets that quote, let's be very perfectly honest, Hamas, a designated terror organization with genocidal intent to annihilate the state of Israel and murder Jews. And so in that sense, this is one example of the preposterous blood libel, which then fuels the false moral equivalence, not just on traditional media, not just on social media, but actually then peddled by politicians, by decision makers, by legislators around the world, and in fact continues to resonate.
Given all this, think about how insane it is for news agencies to avoid telling you what Al Jazeera even really is. And this is particularly striking given that news agencies, including CNN, have been happy to call out Fox News for propaganda. Here's Jim Acosta on CNN.
If you've seen my comments about Fox News in the past, you are well aware of the nickname I've given the network. It's the bullshit factory. But maybe it should be the Bolshevik factory, as in the Bolsheviks, the communists who helped form the Soviet Union, judging by how the network allows one of its most popular hosts to spew pro-Putin propaganda.
And it's true, Tucker Carlson did run with pro-Putin propaganda while he was on Fox. Now would probably be a good time to mention, although it's not necessary for full disclosure, that I worked with these CNN folks when I was there. Ultimately, what I talk about on this show is not about individuals. It's about the system. How can it be that news agencies keep portraying Al Jazeera as a trustworthy source of top-notch journalism and skipping over the fact that it is owned by the authoritarian state of Qatar? Here's a big reason. Years ago, as I mentioned earlier, Al Jazeera launched an American channel, Al Jazeera America. It didn't last long, but it launched at a time when, similar to now actually, a lot of journalists in U.S. news agencies were getting laid off, and they needed jobs. Qatar basically swooped in with a lot of money and hired them, and they're grateful. And so they became team players for that network, and they got their friends to be team players. And Al Jazeera still has its global English channel with, again, a lot of money. And some of these folks might want to work there someday, and certainly currently have friends who work there. And they don't want to remind people of what Al Jazeera really is. They don't even want to remind themselves in a lot of instances that they work or have worked for the Qatari government. So they come up with excuses like, oh, well, sure, it's owned by Qatar, but really it makes separate editorial decisions, blah, 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 blah. None of that matters. Facts are facts. Al Jazeera is state-owned. And according to the way the media operates, they're supposed to acknowledge that every time. And here's a crucial point. Where does all that money come from? The vast majority, fossil fuels, as in oil and gas. Hydrocarbons are 81% of government revenues for Qatar, and the country is the second largest exporter of liquid natural gas. So think for a second about all these people who think they're progressive and love Al Jazeera and keep praising it. Most of them also consider themselves environmentalists, and they talk about how much they hate oil and gas companies for ruining the world. Meanwhile, Qatar is an oil and gas state, and these same folks happily share Qatar's propaganda channel across social media all the time, with no sense of hypocrisy or irony or anything. And for the record, fossil fuel money is central to letting these regimes maintain their grip on power without democracy. I mentioned at the top that the media's frequent adoration of Al Jazeera even leads it to relatively downplay the deaths of journalists around the world. I'll explain that after this. Every year, dozens of journalists around the world are killed. Having worked in journalism for so many years, I, of course, have lost friends who have been covering wars or on other dangerous assignments. But you wouldn't know that all these journalists are killed every year because when one was killed, the media acted as though this never happens. Here's ABC News.
The White House is now calling for a thorough investigation after a Palestinian-American journalist was shot and killed while covering an Israeli raid in the West Bank.
And CNN.
The bullet that killed Al Jazeera reporter Shireen Abu Akleh has been returned to the Palestinian Authority.
And NPR.
To talk more about Shireen Abu Akleh and what her death means for journalists, we've called Abdurrahim Fukari. He is the Washington bureau chief for Al Jazeera, and he is with us now.
No hyperbole here. It was literally the biggest story in the world. And look, I know that the value of someone's life is not at all connected to how many people hear about their death. Still, for people I know who have lost family members who were journalists, the silence of the media in these other cases, compared to this one death being the biggest deal on earth, was painful. It's always tragic when any journalist is killed, but this was not about the tragedy. This was about the media's obsession with something bad only being worth attention when Israel can be blamed. And not only that, but it has to be the biggest story on earth. It's similar to what I talked about in episode 1. If you haven't heard that yet, I encourage you to go back and listen. I told you that the media uses this unbelievably ridiculous term, the occupied territories, to refer to Gaza and the West Bank, even though there are occupied territories all over the world, and Israel pulled out of Gaza 2 decades ago, and the Palestinian Authority itself, in documents about Jericho last year, said that the Israeli occupation period ended in 1994. It's such a strong reminder of how the structure is biased, and you could see that play out in this story as well. Now, I know that I can't hear you, but I'm going to say this anyway. Stop me when I tell you about a case that you have heard about in the news, okay? There's a list from the Committee to Protect Journalists. I clicked to see their list of journalists killed. Now, the one I just referred to took place in 2022. So I went back 3 years further, and I clicked on date, so they're in order. I'm going to read to you now the places in which journalists were killed. Ghana, Libya, Mexico, Honduras, UK, Mexico, Chad, Mexico, Syria, Ukraine, Somalia, Philippines, Syria, Nigeria, Mexico, Somalia, Cameroon, Mexico, Pakistan, Iraq, Haiti, Syria, Philippines, Iraq, Syria, Paraguay, Somalia, Syria, Mexico, Philippines, Afghanistan, Yemen. Okay, you get it. You have to keep scrolling and scrolling and scrolling until you finally get to the one that I was referring to. But hey, stop the presses if Israel can be blamed. And the fact that she was with Al Jazeera, which so much of the mainstream media keeps adoring, well, that just made it even more a part of their wheelhouse. Now, some people have tried to insist that she was purposely targeted. There is no actual evidence of that, and it doesn't make sense because Israel works with journalists from everywhere, including Al Jazeera. But because some people believe that, I looked at the list of journalists believed to have been murdered in that same time frame. Ghana, Mexico, Honduras, Mexico, Ukraine, Philippines, Mexico, Pakistan, Haiti, Philippines, Paraguay, Somalia, Mexico, Philippines, Afghanistan, Yemen, etc. It keeps going and going and going. And every one of these is an individual who lost their life. Now, how about this? Maybe the fact that this one Al Jazeera journalist also had U.S. citizenship made it such a big story for U.S.-based news agencies. That would not explain why other news agencies all over the world rushed to cover this story while never reporting on almost any of these other deaths. But hey, maybe the U.S. citizen thing helps explain it here? Nope, because lots of U.S. journalists get killed and you don't hear about it. Here's a story from ABC about one that got virtually no attention by comparison.
There are some stories that live with you. And for me, it's what happened to Hala Barakat, an American journalist brutally murdered along with her mother in Istanbul, Turkey.
Didn't make sense. The pieces of the puzzle didn't fit.
There was blood splattered everywhere. Authorities say that this was a crime of passion, but others believe that the evidence here points to something else. Turkey can be a dangerous place for journalists.
Here's one from a local station, ABC Action News, Tampa Bay.
The father of Dylan Lyons spoke publicly Thursday, saying in a press conference, "I wish I could have taken the bullet." His son, a 24-year-old TV journalist in Orlando, was shot and killed when a suspect in an earlier shooting returned to the scene, opening fire on a TV crew. The 24-year-old's photographer was also injured but has been released from the hospital.
Dylan went to UCF for journalism, and he loved being a reporter. Just loved it.
And maybe the strongest counterpoint is this. There was a journalist named Brent Renaud. He was killed in Ukraine just a couple of months before the incident in the West Bank that I just told you about. Here is a mention of him on PBS.
Among the dead this morning, according to Ukraine's Interior Ministry, was Brent Renaud, an American filmmaker and journalist who was reporting in the area. Renaud contributed reporting and video for several news organizations in recent years, including the New York Times in 2015, and the paper posted an obituary on its website.
Since he had written for the Times, I checked the website. They did run that piece about him, but they ran incomparably more pieces about this one journalist killed in the West Bank. Now, how about NPR? I typed in the name Brent Renaud at npr.org, and a few stories showed up. But then I clicked this little button that says Heard on Air, meaning it's only going to show you stuff that they actually talked about in their shows, which is where virtually the entire NPR audience is. And those stories mentioning his death disappeared. So listeners would not have heard about it from NPR, but there were a ton of stories on air about one journalist killed in the West Bank. The reasoning that executives give for this kind of thing is always cyclical. They say, oh, well, people are all worked up over this death, so we have to cover it. Well, why are people so much more worked up over this death than other deaths of journalists all over the world? It's in no small part because you have spent decades radicalizing people against Israel through lies, the kinds that I've been discussing in previous episodes. And no agency has done more to make that happen than Qatar's massive global propaganda arm, Al Jazeera. The media's kids' gloves treatment of Al Jazeera is another sign of deeply ingrained bias. So, what can we do to get the media to stop creating this special exception for Al Jazeera? Here's what we can do. In my newsletter, I include some text that you can copy and paste and send in an email, or if you want, on social media, to any news agency anytime you see them mention Al Jazeera and fail to point out that it is Qatari state media. You can show other times that that same news agency has pointed out that other state-owned media are state-owned media. And you can say, why do you create this special exception just for this one outlet? They won't be able to answer you. Something even faster you can do is send me links. Send me what you see or hear. Just pull up a link, and there's 2 different ways to get it to me. The best one is through the newsletter, which, as I mentioned, you can now access through my website or in the show notes, and you'll see it right there. If you're a paid subscriber, then you have access to the comment section, and that's the first thing I check for notes from you. There is also a form at my website that anyone can use. It takes you through a process of confirming your email address. All of this is designed to help keep out, spammers and haters. It works well, and I've been hearing from you a lot. And there's something else you can do that takes less than a minute, and that is share this show. Click the little share button on whatever app you're using. We need to hit critical mass in order to make the real difference that They Stand Corrected can make. When news executives start to see that this show has a substantial and big following, when they keep hearing about it from multiple directions and multiple people, that's when they will get scared and realize that they have to make changes. Because simply complaining you're biased doesn't do it. Showing them that they're getting facts wrong or leaving context out, both of which are necessities for truth, that gets them. And I'm already seeing it now with some of the messages that I'm getting from people inside newsrooms. This is really exciting. There's a lot we can do with your help. All right, that's it for this week. Thank you so much for being here. A big thanks to Nextiva for its support. In business, relationships are everything, and amazing relationships start with a conversation. That's why businesses need Nextiva, the AI-driven platform for seamless, personalized customer interactions across all channels. Businesses can automate up to 90% of their interactions and eliminate 30% or more of their costs. Check it out, nextiva.com.